really interesting research I've been doing to give you this talk today, I learned that cloth of gold was one of the Mongols' greatest gifts to the world during this period of the late 13th and early 14th century. It was so closely associated with the Mongols that it was called in Europe pani tartarici in Latin, meaning tartar cloth. So we see it coming up in inventories all over where it's described in this way. In the Yuan dynasty, we know that the origins of this cloth of gold, two examples of which you see on the screen here in a kind of limited way, that is brocaded, silk that is brocaded with gold using a supplementary weft that passes in the front of the warp threads to produce this gold, these gold patches, that this was something first made in the Jin period, first of all. We have no examples of cloth brocaded with gold prior to the Jin period. We have brocaded cloth plenty as early as the Han Dynasty. We know that in the Yuan period, in Chinese, this material was referred to as na shi shi, which was a translation of an Arabic term, nasij. So this was material that the Mongols saw as something coming from outside the Great Khanate, that is, that part of the Mongols' empire that included China. It had to be produced in great quantities for the court because of their habits of gifting robes in huge numbers to the leading officials, whom Marco naturally numbers at 12,000, these so-called quecitins. So he just gives us a sense of just how much gold brocaded silk was necessary when he writes, "The great Khan gives rich robes adorned with gold pearls and precious stones, with the girdles and shoes, together to the number of 156,000 to those 12,000 barons and knights, and he clothes them all with a like clothing with himself, and of great value, so that when they are dressed and thus richly adorned, they all seem to be of a kind. And when the Lord wears any robe, these barons and knights are likewise dressed in one of the same color." He also gives us the sense that these robes were very long-lasting. Yet every year, the number of robes that needed to be woven and presented numbered 156,000. The question is, how could this be done? First of all, however you look at it, this is a lot of silk, particularly given that the silks that were worn at court were brocaded with gold. That is gold foil that was stabilized on a substrate of either animal gut or leather or paper, and then wrapped around a silk thread. So this actually distinguished these gold threads from some of the threads that were used in Central Asian weaving, in Western Asia, in particular in the region we now call Iran, where instead drawn gold threads were used, drawn gold, pulled out, in other words, and not derived from foil. Now, the scholar Thomas Olson, whose book I've given you on the suggested reading, who is a master of all things textile from the Mongol Empire and much else, says that this number of presents of robes actually wouldn't have been beyond the reach of the Khan. It sounds like a lot of gold, and to attain the necessary flexibility for weaving, it had to be extremely pure, 24 karat essentially. But in fact, gold is so ductile that 1 ounce can be pounded out to leaves only 7/millionths of an inch thick. And that would be a piece then, 1 ounce would make 9 square meters of gold. So it pounds out to a great thinness. Thus, a lot of thread could be made fairly economically. It still was costing the Khan a lot, I have to say. But we see in this period also the interesting style of the court evolving into something that becomes quite familiar, I think, in later dynasties. That is, robes that feature this square element in the chest, in this case woven in gold, and in this case with a falcon chasing a hare. And this is a silk twill damask of the Yuan period that is very like the kinds of descriptions we find in texts of these types of robes that are tied on the side with multiple ties, and thus create a kind of a pleated effect around the waist, which would then be covered with a broad belt. So again, this is an innovation of the Mongol period. One, the color coding. Here we have blue, which would have been specific to a very a specific feast, the badging of the wearer so that his rank could be very clearly determined. And this, I think, separates this from the earlier cloths of gold that were made by the Jin Empire. And this is an example of one from the tomb of Prince Qi of the Jin dynasty that was found in Heilongjiang in 1988, excavated in other words. And as you see, it's a kind of a darkened, but you can see clearly in the detail the band is woven in gold, and that is done in a pseudo-Kufic script. So they're trying to emulate something from Western Asia. It's very likely that by the Jin period already there were weaving establishments that were set up in the region of their capitals. But we know for certain that in the Mongol period, these types of factories were set up all over. I'll show you an example here of a gorgeous example of a cloth of gold, which is basically entirely gold, with the weft threads actually are kind of dark red that enables the gold to be set forward, and is done in a very Western Asian style, probably of Central Asian origin, given the medallion-like formation of the overall design. As I said, the Mongols famously loved gold. And the reason why was they associated it with the sun, so for their shamanic worship of the sky, Tengri or heaven. They loved both blue and they loved gold. They loved it for their utensils and they loved it for their clothes. Marco describes entire outfits of gold made of cloth that must have looked something like this. In this case, the cloth is decorated with winged lions and winged griffins, and it's in the Cleveland Museum, dates to the 13th century. So on Kublai's birthday, according to Marco, Kublai and everyone else wore gold. Marco Polo accurately provides Kublai's birthday. Among other things, it was September 28th, and he reports that. This is like one of the bits of information that makes us think he actually was there, that he recorded it. It was the biggest occasion of the year, except for the Lunar New Year feast when everybody wore white. And he writes, on this day of his birth, the great Khan is dressed in the most noble cloth of the purest beaten gold that he has, and quite 12,000 barons and knights who are called the faithful companions of the Lord are dressed like him in a color and in a fashion like that of the robe of the great Lord. Not that they are so dear robes as those of the king, but they are of one color, and all are cloth of silk and gold. And all those who are robed have great girdles of vast value, of leather worked with thread of gold and silver very cunningly given to them, and a pair of shoes of leather worked with silver thread very skillfully. And the Lord gives them all these robes, which are of very great value. So the question of where this material was made, I think we see in this case an example probably coming from the region of Western Asia or Central Asia. But there was a movement of experts and expert weavers and technologists who specialized in the textile arts rather than of the fabric itself in many cases. And this is something that Thomas Olson talks about in great detail in his book. We know that there were textile centers established near Khanbalik or Dadu, the main capital, at a place called Hongzhou, and also at a place that's described in the work of Rashid al-Din Hamani as called Simali, which we now think is a place called Shinmalin, where there are records from the Yuan period that talk about the displacement of artisans from Samarkand to this region, where not only did they establish weaving workshops, they also brought in Chinese apprentices to learn these new skills in weaving, and they also grew grapes, out of which they made wine. And this is of interest to me because it connects to a famously drunken monk artist who we have a great grape painting of at the Berkeley Art Museum that I've been interested in recently, and who talks in his poetry about this wine growing region, wine grape growing region. So we have these two centers now established, Shimalin and also a place called Hangzhou, that were established near the capital, and also the fact that there was a bureau, the so-called gold brocade office, or the Nashishiju, which was established in the year 1278, and it was run as part of the larger agricultural office or ministry by, among others, a Mongol official whose name was Polo Jingxiang. So I'm going to talk about him again later, hopefully. The origins of this kind of weaving, therefore, I think we can find in Central Asia, not China, that is weaving with gold. We see that there were no cloth of gold in China prior to the Jin period, but that this cloth became a universal object of desire by the 14th century, certainly by the early 14th century, and that the displacement of artisans during the Mongol conquest and the training of locals in these formally exotic techniques and their refinement by Chinese weavers and their transformation and improvement of them over time really gives us a vast world where this kind of material was being produced. So lots of this fabric came into Asia, the rest of Asia, traveled around Asia as the techniques did, and to Europe. It was one of the most important objects of trade in the period of the late Middle Ages. However, little of it was made in Chinese silk centers, as we now know. So those pieces of gold brocaded silk that are found in the papal treasury, for example, or in diocesan treasuries around Europe, almost all of that material came from Central Asia or Iran. Now, this is interesting news, and it's also kind of late-breaking news, I think, for those who study textiles. There were distinctive silk patterns for each weaving center, of which Marco Polo mentions many, especially in Central Asia. So as he travels through, he's talking about these great centers. A lot of it came as diplomatic gifts. It was extremely chic to wear it. And we see it appearing in the paintings of Italian masters of the Quattrocento, in particular in the early years of the Quattrocento. So we're talking about the very moment when the Renaissance is being birthed in Europe. So we also see images of Mongols appearing in these paintings, and I think a lot of you have probably seen these before, but this is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Martyrdom of the Franciscans at Ciuta, dating to 1336, where you can see a Mongol wearing that hat, very much like the hat depicted in Le Livre des Merveilles. Another Mongol face front on the left side is featured here too. We also have a Mongol appearing clearly and wearing cloth of gold of a sort that is very similar to an example in the Cleveland Museum that you see on the very far right, who is part of this scene of the crucifixion of Christ, and where you can see he is clearly bargaining for the cloth of Christ right here, and here's your blow up where you can see this cloth of gold. He's wearing, again, the Mongol hat that's very typical of this period. In fact, this fragment that's in Cleveland now of this similar pattern came out of Tibet. So it was one of those textiles that was kept in Tibet. It has a long inscription in Tibetan on it that suggests when it got there and when it arrived in a treasury there. Here's another example of Paolo Veneziano's Coronation of the Virgin from 1350, where you can see that the robes here, where there's a featured flower, but then a lot of floral activity in the background, is quite similar to this dalmatic or priest's robe of lampas, compound weave, from either Central Asia or Dadu. This may, in fact, be an example that might well have come from China, but possibly more likely from Central Asia. And of course, in Simone Martini's Annunciation, around 1333, we see the angel Gabriel wearing this beautiful silk robe as he appears before Mary with the good news. And just to show you in detail how close this comes to an example in the Metropolitan Museum, a kind of textile clearly made in Central Asia. Now, this type of textile also appears in the tomb of a very interesting man of this period, a man called Congrande I della Scala, who was the most important prince in the city of Verona, which was, of course, one of Venice's main rivals during this period. Here's another robe. I couldn't find a good photograph of the actual robe, but you can see here that Congrande had a robe that is clearly cloth of gold of some sort, and he was very proud of it. He was buried with it. Here's his equestrian statue. He looks so charming here, peeking out of his armor with his armored horse. He died in 1329, and he was buried in a sumptuous tomb here at the Santa Maria Antica in Verona, where you can see that he had two dogs holding up his coat of arms on either side of his epitaph. So And I'm showing you John Ruskin's famous drawing of these dogs too, because they were really famous all over Europe. Why? Because Can Grande #1 della Scala was Dante's patron, as in the writing of the Divine Comedy. So he's a very well-known figure on the literary side of things as well. So everybody admired him greatly. And Can Grande, of course, is a pun on big dog, right? So he was the big dog of Verona. Can Grande, interestingly, also is the great Khan, right? So we know him making, in his name, just making a kind of reference to Kublai, to the Mongol realms, etc., and trying to emulate that degree of magnificence in his own life and material wealth. Other things came into Europe in painting as well, and here is one I think maybe a little suspect, but I wanted to show to you anyway. Giotto's Crucifixion from 1330, which is in the Louvre, is said to feature in the helmets of these characters over here, especially this one face front, Pugpa script, how it might have been understood, this square script that was the universal language. Clearly, the helmet is meant to be Mongolian. Here's an example of a Mongol helmet with a Tibetan mantra, Om Ha-hum, 14th century. So you can see it has the same lamellar construction as is depicted here. So Pugpa script may well have been known because of the fact that it was printed on Mongol paper currency. And Marco Polo makes a great deal out of this paper currency and its wide circulation. He's very attentive to it, and he describes in detail how the paper was made for it and how it was printed. He presents paper currency really as a defining feature of Kublai's empire, and he never fails to mention its use in the various cities of Cathay in northern China, and also its use in the cities of southern China, which he calls Manji. Another object of trade, of course, and I just wanted very briefly to show you some examples of this because they're just so beautiful, are of horses that were sent in tribute. 9 tribute horses in a 1324 hand scroll in the Nelson Atkins. There's a beautiful tribute scroll right here in the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco as well, where we see the grooms leading in these very special gifts for the Khan. Marco tells us that just to run the post system, the Mongol Empire maintained 200,000 horses at any moment. In the year 1342, the Pope Benedict XII, who by the way was the patron of Thomas Aquinas and Francis Bacon, a very broad-minded Renaissance man really, sent a gift of a war horse to the Mongol Khan Togun Temur, who had sent him a letter in the year 1336, but which took quite a while to arrive in the Pope's hands and then to return with this gift of the horse in an embassy headed by a man named Giovanni Marignoli. And here you see this gorgeous horse with its very auspicious markings, cloud-like markings here, in a scroll that was only recently discovered in the collection of the Palace Museum in Beijing. And here you see the Khan surrounded by his members of his court. And by the way, the seal of the Qianlong Emperor of the 18th century, I can't resist, but he's always there. So horses as tribute are a constant in the art of the Mongol Empire, not just in the part in the very far east, in the Great Khanate, but also in the western regions. In the library of the Topkapi Saray in Istanbul, there's a beautiful painting that has recently been reconstructed to show 2 Mongol officials oddly wearing different colored robes. I'm not sure about this. But it looks very much as though this painting was done by a Chinese painter. But for this very stylized horse with its extraordinary neck, as you can see here, and very long legs. So here we have the Topkapi Saray titling this 2 dignitaries holding the rein of a magnificent stallion. And indeed he is. I just wanted to show you this is not an impossible horse. Here is an Akhalteki horse, type of horse raised and bred in Turkmenistan, with the same kind of extraordinary neck, almost like a swan. And they come in various colors, including palomino, but they look like they're made out of gold, literally. These must have been extremely desirable gifts during this period of time. And we see in and as Marco concludes his tale of China before he heads on to the rest of Asia, which unfortunately, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to not talk about today, we see him talking about the great city of Kinsei or Hangzhou, where it's depicted as a bustling town with buildings very close to one another, that he describes as the largest city in the world, with more artisans per square inch than any other city in the world, 12,000 on every street. Not surprising, leading to the palace of the former Song emperor and his empress. And he describes the vast revenues that the Khan was able to glean from this city alone, which was a major trading center located as it was at the southerly end of the Grand Canal, and thus leading to the port cities along the southeast coast. And it was in this region that Marco takes note of porcelain. So you've probably been wondering where porcelain stands in all of this trade. And the answer is, during Marco's period, it was very little known. It was probably not known at all. Marco is, in fact, the first person to describe it, and he's the one to whom credit is given for coming up with the name porcelain, because he described this material as porcelana, using the Portuguese term for a kind of a small shell. So I'm sure you know this story. But he talks about it as this way: the dishes are made of a crumbly earth or clay, which is dug as though from a mine, and stacked in huge mounds, and then left for 30 or 40 years exposed to wind, rain, and sun. By this time, the earth is so refined that dishes made of it are an azure tint with a very brilliant sheen. He's obviously describing Qingbai porcelain that has a slight bluish tint right outside the door. You can see beautiful examples of it. Here is a porcelain jug or jar that he is said to have brought back from China as part of the actually rather limited number of things he brought back, even though after he arrived he was so rich that he was called Il Milione, the millionaire. That was his nickname in Venice. So it is a Qingbai type of jar, rather rough. The decoration on the surface is done with a clay slip, raised to create this raised design, as you see here, and then covered with a glaze and fired at a fairly high temperature that makes it somewhat white in color. Now, what we know about the arrival of ceramics in Europe during this period is very limited. Interestingly, the blue and white platters that would subsequently in the 14th century become the main object of trade between the Islamic Mongol Empire and China did not appear in this period in Europe. Rather, what we have are some limited number of examples of Qingbai ware with slip decoration or with cutout decoration of the sort that you see here. This is a lovely example, one of a pair, very rare, in the Asian Art Museum, which is in the loggia. You can see it with slip decoration, beaded slip decoration on a stand for heating wine. And here, a vase with Western-style fittings that's in the V&A with a raised floral design. And in the center, of course, the absolute exemplar of all early porcelains, the Fonthill Garnier vase, now in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. This so-called Fonthill Garnier vase is regarded as the oldest documented porcelain to come from China to Europe. It's a porcelain vase with a Qingbai glaze, as you can see, probably made sometime at the beginning of the 14th century. The history of the vase is actually rather well known. It suggests that it arrived in Europe as a gift to King Louis the Great of Hungary, and that it was given by an embassy of Nestorian Christians from China who visited the Pope Benedict XII, the same enlightened patron pope, in 1338. So this is just around the time when the Pope was receiving a letter from Togun Temur that he subsequently returned as a gift, the gift of that magnificent stallion. The piece was then mounted by King Louis, presumably and refitted as a pitcher, as you can see here in this early 18th century drawing of it from France, where it eventually wound up. But then it was given as a gift to Charles III of Durazzo upon his ascension to the throne of Naples in 1381. So we see this thing moving around a lot. It obviously was considered to be extremely valuable. And so, in other words, we have a vase that is moving around. It's being transformed as it arrives so that its usage is more appropriately fitted to the kind of table service that the great courts of the West were used to, and it's literally being now examined microscopically to try to understand how it was made. And as you know, this whole story of the arcana, how the secret to porcelain production was finally cracked, is one that really goes on for a very, very long time, but really peaks in the Yuan period in the latter part of the 14th century, after Marco was long gone. Now, I wanted to say that Marco Polo, throughout the book, has a very great interest in women, and he talks about them all the time. He's constantly noticing how beautiful they were, how free the Mongol ladies were who rode on horseback with their husbands together to the hunt, how delicate and refined the women of South China were. He describes them as the most beautiful women in the world, with no peer anywhere else. Their manners exquisite, everything about them elegant. You know, he just goes on, and his description of Hangzhou, his admiration for the former empress of the Southern Song is really palpable. He describes her as literally as a hero who saved the city from destruction. So women were a very, very great interest to him, and he is eager, really, to detail dynastic marriages in his text. So as we know, at the very beginning of the book, we have this incident where we learn that the Polo brothers, who are there on their own in their first trip, are trying desperately, or I'm sorry, not in their first trip, but in their second trip with Marco, are trying desperately to return to Venice after 20-some years in the Great Khanate. And they importune Kublai saying, we want to go home. You know, they're worried he's going to die, things will fall apart, their position is going to be insecure. They're denied over and over again. But ultimately, when a letter comes from the great Ilk Khan, Arghun, requesting a new wife to replace his deceased wife Bolgana, or Zibeline, who I mentioned earlier, the Khan makes it very clear, the Ilk Khan makes it very clear that this woman needs to be of the lineage of Bolgana. This is something specified in Bolgana's will. And so this starts a whole adventure, which is again cataloged here in Rashid al-Hamadani's Jami al-Tarawik, the so-called compendium of chronicles in the 14th century, where the lady Kokachin, who is of the right lineage, is chosen at the age of 17 to go back to travel to the Ilk Khanate and marry Arghun, who was supposed to be, by the way, the handsomest man in the world. So just so you know, she's waiting for, you know, she's going to be married. That must have been some temptation. So, she's accompanied by 3 officials, Mongol officials from the Ilk Khanate who had been sent by Arghun, whose names Marco Polo records. And he gives them their actual names. So this has become a great object of scholarship. The reason being that when the 3 attempted to take Kokachin to Arghun overland, they ran into battles between the Ilk Khanate and the Golden Horde. They couldn't pass. So they had to turn around and come back. And when they returned to court, the Khan said, don't try to go overland, it's just too disturbed. Instead, go by boat. So he sends them down to Zaitan, or Jiaozhou, on the southeast Chinese coast, and there he arranges for 12 large ships, each with 4 masts, and equipped with crews numbering over 200 in some cases, to take Kokachin and the 3 envoys back to China. Now here we find the story taking a very interesting twist, because it's at this very moment that Marco Polo is claiming in his text that he is the emissary who is meant to accompany Kokachin. He writes all about it and seems very familiar with where they were going. And the reason why the Khan seems to have sent him is because he had just returned from India, now with lots of information about the coast along that route. And so now he's going to be retracing it. He seems like the obvious expert to send along. However, he's not mentioned in the Chinese records. He's not mentioned in the Ilk Khanate records, while the other 3 envoys are. However, now there is this fragment that exists of the great encyclopedia of the Yongle period, published in the early 15th century, now mostly lost. But in this fragment, we have a passage that talks about these 3 envoys getting on the ship with a whole number of other foreign travelers, including Falang travelers, meaning Europeans. So Chinese scholars have now concluded that these are probably the Polos, all three of them, on their way back to Europe via Tabriz, where they're going to drop off Kokochin. So now the history of these kinds of marriages, that spanned great distances are very typical in this period. We have, for example, Hulagu, who married Dokus Hatun, who is an historian Christian, and again, as depicted in Rashid al-Din Hamadani's Jami al-Tarawiq, the Compendium of Chronicles. We also know the story, so this Ilkhanate was a place where these marriages were typically taking place. We have Maria Paleologina, or Despina Khatun, who was the illegitimate daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII, Paleologus, who was sent to wed the Mongol Ilkhan Hulagu, who is the grandfather of Arghun, by the way, in the year 1265. But when he died, the same year she wed his son Abaka, who was the father of Arghun. So needless to say, when Arghun needed a wife, he looked far afield in the lineages that might be of benefit to him diplomatically. And here's a painting, again, from the Compendium of Chronicles that shows Abaka Khan on horseback with Arghun holding the rein and Ghazan, his son, as a child on Arghun's shoulder. And Ghazan eventually wed the Lady Kokochin, who was brought to Tabriz by, among others, the Polos, presumably, or so they claim, because of the fact that Arghun died while she was en route. So the natural thing in the Mongol custom was to invoke the leveret and allow this to move forward. Now, interestingly, this takes us into a world where we find Rashid al-Din Hamadani, a Jewish physician from further to the west, engaged in writing a history of the world, of a sort, and a geography of a sort that rivals what Marco Polo produced. Marco produced his book first, but we have Rashid al-Din giving us a lot of the same kind of material, including a complete history of the Mongols and their conquests, in which he was aided by a very famous Mongol who was sent from Kambalik by Kublai to the Ilkhanate named Bolo Jingxiang. I mentioned him earlier as the Minister of Agriculture, if you remember, whose ministry was in charge of silk weaving as well. So we have this Mongol informant, essentially, to Rashid al-Din Hamadani. Why did Rashid al-Din Hamadani need an informant? Because the history of the Mongols was contained in a book, the so-called Golden Book, or Alten Dekter, which only Mongols were allowed to read. So Bolud, who had started as a cook to Kublai Khan, a very high position actually, and then later became the master of ceremonies in his court, interestingly rises to this position of envoy to the Ilkhanate, becomes Rashid al-Din Hamadani's best friend. They actually served as best man and giver away of the bride in a wedding to another woman that Ghazan undertook at some point in his lifetime. So in the meanwhile, we have Rashid al-Din Hamadani constructing this book and ordering illustrated manuscripts of it that included portraits of all the emperors of China, by the way. Here we have Qin Shi Huang at the top and Han Wu Di at the bottom in this. Also histories of the main religions to which the Mongols belonged. Ghazan, for example, was born a Buddhist, but he converted to Islam when he reached maturity. So we have stories from the Judeo-Christian tradition, Jonah and the whale, there's a whole list of them, the birth of Muhammad, and also scene of Kushinagara where the Buddha achieved nirvana. So all of these things are brought together in this vast encyclopedia that was made possible by Rashid al-Din's vast scholarship and his willingness to consult widely among specialists. Now, why have I made such a point of this man, Bolo, or Bolad, the Mongol, Jingxiang, which was his title, putting him among these 12,000 favorite barons of Kublai Khan? Because I think he seems to solve the mystery of an image that I'm going to be talking about in January, when we take up the movement of famous images of Buddhism across Asia in the second half of this course. This is a rubbing of a stele that was carved in the year 1597 by the Buddhist monk Shaoqian for posting in a Buddhist temple in Beijing, where the auspicious sandalwood image, that is the original portrait, the one taken from life according to the story, was placed. And the long inscription that you see around is the record of its travels, from its creation by the king of Udayana, who sent sculptors to the heaven of 33, where the Buddha was preaching to his long-deceased mother, all the way through its movements across Central Asia into the hands of the emperors of China. Now, in the part that gets to where we're talking about the Yuan dynasty, right here, we see the name Dachan Bo. Now, when this inscription was translated for the exhibition Latter Days of the Law, this was the leading image in the exhibition for obvious reasons. It's the original image of the Buddha. This was translated as, in a very, very interesting way, which I think you're probably anticipating already, where Bo was read as Polo, as Marco Polo. So the translation included in the Latter Days of the Law catalog reads, in the 12th year of the Zhou-Yuan era of the Emperor Shizu of the Yuan, that is Kublai, in 1275, the great official envoy Marco Polo, Bo, and his entourage, accompanied by Buddhist monks and musicians, offered the image to the throne, and it was kept in the Renju Den for the next 15 years. If this had been true, it would be the only reference to Marco Polo in the entire archive of records from China that we have. How remarkable was this? Of course, this Bo was not our own Marco Polo, not that Bo, but Bolad, the minister of ceremonies for Kublai Khan, an eventual collaborator with another great geographer of the Mongol period, Rashid al-Din. How remarkable also to consider that when the Lady Kukujin arrived in Tabriz in the company of 3 envoys that are named and the Polo family, the two could very well have met. Now, I recite this anecdote to underscore the fact that one of the most remarkable changes the Mongols brought to the world was the highest level of patronage for the encouragement of intellectual curiosity. And this was a curiosity that was shared by Marco Polo and his doppelganger Bolad. The same type of intellectual patronage was growing in Europe at the same time. Marco Polo's story, I think more than anything else, highlights the value that rulers across Eurasia put in verifiable knowledge and not in alternative facts, in technologies of making, and in the most complex products of human ingenuity and creativity. It was a time of terror, it's true, but it was also a time that in many ways heralded the transformations of human life that characterize the modern era. Mobility, a fluid system of exchange, industrialization, specialization, an encyclopedic impulse, and a sense of limited possibility. Limitless possibility, I should say. This is the story that we'll continue to tell over the course of our year thinking about art in motion, and I look forward to seeing all of you again next week and in the weeks to come. Thank you very much.